And good morning, good morning. It's Dr. Chris Roddenberry coming to you from South Campus here at Wake Tech. It's good to see everybody today. Looks like we have a couple of attendees. If you're attending and you have signed in with your Gmail account, go ahead and type in the chat bar and let me know you're here. It's good to see you folks this morning. This is the first day of the daily lectures that I'll be giving for the next 8 weeks. I'll be giving these lectures at 9 o'clock every morning, Monday through Thursday. You can come live and participate in the fun, or if you can't make it, you are always welcome to watch the recording. The link that I use for the live stream will also be a recording at the end of the broadcast. Looks like we've got Andrew here in the house, as well as Cielito Martinez. Good morning, folks. How are you doing? I think both of you probably have, but I'm going to go ahead and say this for those people who haven't done this yet, if you two don't mind. I'm going to go ahead and go to the whiteboard. Remember, don't forget to join Remind for text reminders. All you have to do is text at SU22PSY150 to the number 81010, and you'll join my Remind group, and you'll get +2 in extra credit for doing that. And you'll also get reminders for these daily lectures, as well as for assignments that are coming up this semester. Also, even more important is the fact that you need to complete the course entry quiz by Thursday at 11:59 p.m. Remember, if you don't complete the course entry quiz by 11:59 p.m. this Thursday, I will have to drop you from this course. No questions asked. I see Christina is in the house too. How are you doing, Christina? It is so good to see you. For those of you watching this video, Christina joined as a subscriber. I'm going to ask you to hit the like button and add yourself as a subscriber too, and you'll get reminders whenever I'm having a broadcast, so you will not miss any broadcasts this summer. I'd like to go ahead and thank you. Hey, we have Lewis in the house, Rylan in the house, Shaniqua Howell in the house. Fantastic. Looks like we're going to have a great crowd this morning. Thanks for coming, everybody. I appreciate you getting up this early and coming to a psychology class. We're going to get ready and talk about chapter 1 here in a little bit. Don't forget, tonight is the Wednesday webinar. We're having the Wednesday webinar on Microsoft Teams. If you want to join the webinar, all you have to do is open Microsoft Teams. You see it's open right here. You're going to click on the calendar right here. And if you scroll down to 7 p.m. on Wednesday night, you'll see that we have a meeting. All you have to do is click on this little button right here, and you will enter the meeting. Don't forget to log in using your student ID before you join the meeting. Otherwise, you're going to lose some of the student utilities. So go ahead and make sure you do that. Okay. I know I am so glad to see you were my first subscriber of this summer. Please go ahead and subscribe to my channel. You are my 301st subscriber, Christina. I am moving up towards being a D-list YouTube star, so thank you very much for contributing to that. Let's go ahead and talk a little bit about chapter 1. Actually, before we go to chapter 1, I have a question for you. Go ahead and type in the chat bar. I want to know, what do you think a psychologist does? If you would, go ahead and type that in the chat bar. What does a psychologist do? What do you think a psychologist does? Remember, I'm a psychologist. We have lots of different kinds of psychologists. But what exactly do you think a psychologist does? I want to see some answers in the chat bar, so I'm going to sit here and wait for just a second. In the meantime, I want to tell you that I graduated from the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill with my PhD in social psychology in 2003. Go Heels. I know we probably have some NC State fans out there. I love you Wolfpackers too, but I am a true blue Tar Heel. Okay, Shaniqua says they determine mental illness. Yes, some of them do determine mental illness. They're called clinical psychologists. Yes, some of them do study human behavior. In fact, a lot of psychologists study human behavior. Gustav says they study the human mind, emotions. Not a bad guess either. Gustav studies behavior, makes assessments of people and groups. Okay, sounds to me like you folks have already gotten a head start because I'm getting a lot of really, really good answers. Oh, Christina Hernandez, yes. Depending upon the field. That's what we're going to talk about today. We're going to talk about the different kinds of fields that psychologists do. Louis Tapia, they do research and study humans' behavior. Man, a lot of great answers. Each and every one of you are right. And what I'm going to try to convince you of today is that psychology is a very complex field with lots of different kinds of professionals that engage in lots of different tasks. You're going to find some of these in clinical psychologist's office, psychiatric units. You're going to find some psychologists in schools, kind of like me. You're even going to find psychologists in courtrooms and in businesses. So you folks have a lot of really good ideas, and we're going to talk about that today. So what we're going to do today is we're going to talk about what psychology is, the founders of psychology, 3 famous psychologists, and we're going to talk about the modern subfields of psychology. As a quick check-in, everybody is hearing my voice well enough, and you are seeing my video without any skips or technical problems. It looks like I have an excellent connection here by looking at the metrics on my side. But go ahead and let me know if everything is going well. Fantastic. Excellent, excellent, excellent. Okay, let's go ahead and get started. Psychology. Here's the crazy thing. Psychology is actually one of the most ancient activities in the entire world, and yet it's one of the newer sciences in the world. What do you mean, Chris? Well, you know what? Because as long as we've had campfires and time to sit around them, people have wondered about what it means to be human. What does it mean to have a memory? What does it mean to love? What does it mean to be sad? What does it mean to know reality? These are all, in a sense, questions about the human mind, and they've been asked as long as people have had time to sit around and ponder them. But in order to be a science, one needs to engage in measurement and observation. And the mind and mental processes have only been measured fairly recently. So you can think of psychology as one of the oldest endeavors, but one of the newest sciences. Now, you folks are taking this class in a college class, so we don't have time to do what typically happens in an AP psychology class in high school. In an AP psychology class, your teacher would spend an entire month talking to you about all of what we would call the proto-psychologists, the Egyptians, the Greeks, and the Roman philosophers who contemplated what it meant to be a human being. And we think of those as the first proto-psychologists, not quite psychologists, but the founders of what would become modern psychology. And you know, these Egyptians, Greeks, and Romans all asked the question, what is reality? Is there such a thing as a soul? We're going to talk about that in chapter 3. How do we remember things? The ancient philosophers contemplated these things many, many eons ago. Okay? And so you can think of psychology as having its roots in these ancient philosophers. Okay? Now, here's the deal. Science equals measurement. And this is one of the things that I'm going to ask you about on your test. In order for something to be scientific, it needs to be something that you can measure and evaluate. Science is not a test tube. Science isn't biology or chemistry. Science is simply a set of tools of observation. So, science can be anything and science can be nothing, depending upon how you engage in your activity. Okay? So, in order to be scientific, you must observe and measure what you're studying. Here's the crazy thing. Even though these ancient philosophers and people have been talking about mental constructs for thousands of years, people always believed that it was impossible to measure the mind. The typical belief was that no minds acted alike. Each and every one of us had a different kind of mind that engaged in different mental processes, right? And so, unlike molecules, unlike fire, unlike physics and gravity, people used to think that minds did not act in a similar fashion. But this fellow right here, Gustav Fechner, a German physiologist in 1851, published this book called The Elements of Psychophysics. It was called psychophysics. He didn't even call it psychology. And what he demonstrated was that the mind did behave in very scientific ways, and that you could measure these mental processes. He discovered this thing called a just noticeable difference, and it's the smallest amount of change in a stimulus that the human being can detect half of the time, right? So if you're comparing two weights, how can you tell if one weight is slightly heavier than the other weight? If you're drinking 2 glasses of sweet tea, how can you tell if one glass of tea is slightly sweeter than the other glass of tea? If you're looking at 2 lights, how can you tell that one light is a little bit brighter than the other light? It turns out that there's a very systematic relationship between the amount something has to change and human beings' ability to detect that change. A stimulus typically has to change about 1/40th of its original intensity for the human mind to perceive it. And Gustav Fechner was the first person to demonstrate that with observation and measurement. Yes, Gustav. Oh, right, Gustav over here. Yes, Gustav, you may have even been named for the famous Gustav Fechner. Are you in fact German, Gustav, or are you another nationality? I'd be interested in finding out. Okay, fantastic. So he really represents what I would call the father of scientific psychology. And by scientific, I mean measurement. He was the first person to measure the mind. Now, here's the deal. Your book is actually going to refer to a couple of other guys as sort of the fathers of psychology. And I would argue that all 3 of these people were responsible for creating what we now know of as the science of psychology. Now, your textbook's going to talk about this fellow, Wilhelm Wundt, another German. And they're going to call him the father of psychology. Now, he's very important because he opened the first psychology lab in Leipzig, Germany in 1879. And he was the first person to award PhDs in psychology. Before Wilhelm Wundt, you couldn't be a psychologist. It didn't exist. But he opened the first psych lab and he commissioned the first PhDs in psychology. And if you look at this map over here, this is in your textbook, you're going to see all of these colleges in America. All of these dates represent when psychology departments were opened in United States colleges. And all of these colleges used PhD students from Wilhelm Wundt's lab to open their psychology departments. So even though Wilhelm Wundt's type of science is no longer done, his students would become the first generation of psychologists that would create psych labs in the world. And Gustav is Dominican. He's Gustavo Santos. Okay, that's all right. Who knows? Maybe your mom was Dominican who was a fan of the famed Gustav Fechner. Gustav is just your nickname. Okay, that's cool. All right, so we have Gustav Fechner, who was the first person to measure the mind. Wilhelm Wundt opened the first psychology lab in the world in Leipzig, Germany, and handed out the first PhDs and created the first generation of students. And there's this fellow named William James. He's an American from Harvard University. He was actually a philosopher, but he was sort of, back in the day, you could sort of be a philosopher and a chemist and a psychologist all at the same time. Graduate programs weren't quite as regimented and organized as they are today. But in 1890, he published the first textbook in psychology called The Principles of Psychology. You can see the book down below me. It's actually a 2-volume series, and basically he laid out all of the ideas and concepts that he thought needed to be studied in psychology. And if you think about it, if you go back and look at his book and look at the history of psychology in the 20th century, you're going to see that he pretty much provided the roadmap for psychology in the 20th century. So for your exam, for your homework and for your exam, I want you to know why each of these three people was important in the founding of psychology, okay? Remember, let me go ahead and make a note here. Let me make a note for you. Boom. Let's go to that. Fechner. First measurement. Wundt. First lab. And James. First textbook. Okay? And that's what I want you to know for these three fathers of psychology. They're very, very important. Okay, let's move on a little bit. Now, so in trying to create the field of psychology, there was some sort of question about how we were going to study the human being. When I asked you folks at the beginning of class, what does a psychology do? Some of you suggested they study the mind. Some of you said they studied behavior. Some of you said they studied mental illness. If you think about it, there's a lot to study in human beings. And so as psychology was getting established, there were different questions about how best to study the human being. And Wilhelm Wundt and William James sort of started this off by having the first major debate in psychology. How shall we study human beings? Wilhelm Wundt was what was known as a structuralist. He wanted to study how mental experience is organized in the mind. So, how many different personality traits do we need to describe people is a structural question. What does personality look like? Another way you might think is how are memories stored in the brain? Where are memories stored and what are memories made of? This is a structural question. How is the mind structured? And so Wilhelm Wundt was a structuralist. On the other hand, William James was more of a functionalist. He argued that, you know what, it's really hard to measure the structure of the mind. Instead, let's just focus on the functions that the mind engages in. What does the mind help us to do? So instead of asking what your personality looks like, William James might ask the question, how does your personality affect your ability to maintain a romantic relationship? Have any of you ever met a person that has a bad temper or dated a person with a bad temper or a person who is paranoid or a person who lies a lot? You know, it is difficult for these people to maintain a romantic relationship. Maybe you've been with a person who has an easygoing personality or who never lies, and it's easy to be in a romantic relationship with them. So really, the first debate was in how should we study the human being? Should we try to organize and study how the mind is structured, or should we study what functions, mental processes help us to do? Does that make sense? And this was sort of the birth of modern psychology. How shall we study human beings? Now, as you folks know, we study human beings in way more ways than just these two approaches. Now, your book is going to talk about these different schools of thought. So, starting in the 1900s, from 1900 to 1950, the next generation of psychologists, trained and given PhDs by Wundt, began to ask more complex questions and find different ways to study the human beings. And your book's going to call these psychology schools of thought. And you'll see there in this chart that's in your textbook, number 1 and number 2 are structuralism and functionalism. In the 1800s, Wilhelm Wundt thought we should measure the structure of the mind, him and Edward Titchener and Margaret Washburn. On the other hand, William James and Mary Whitkin Calkins said we should study instead the function of the mind. Well, in the 1900s, different approaches to studying the mind began to emerge. There was Freud and psychoanalytic theory. There was Wolfgang Kohler and Gestalt psychology. There was the behaviorist John Watson. There was the humanist Abraham Maslow. And they all had different approaches to studying the human being. Humans are complex characters, so you can study lots of different things about them. And now what I want you to do for this class is I want you to focus on three very important psychologists and their point of views. Sigmund Freud, John Watson, and the cognitive perspective ushered in by George Miller. Okay, now let's talk briefly. I'm going to talk briefly about each of these three characters, and I want you to know them for your first exam. So for the example, we have psychoanalytic theory and Sigmund Freud. How many of you have ever had something traumatic happen to you as a kid that still haunts you? Maybe somebody beat you up or teased you. Maybe somebody attacked you. Maybe something bad or embarrassing or shameful happened in your life, and you still carry it around. And maybe you don't think about it every day, but it affects the way you think and feel and behave, right? Do you think if you were sexually assaulted as a young child, that would have an impact on who you were? Do you think so? Could you imagine what that would do to your mind? Now, you might actually forget the abuse, right? And not even know about it, but it would affect your behavior. Sigmund Freud was the first psychologist to have this insight. He had this insight that sometimes things are going on underneath the surface that affect who you are, that affect how you behave, that you may not even be aware of. Have any of you folks ever heard of repressed memories? People who go to therapists and have repressed memories revealed to them, remember things that happened earlier in their life. This is a Sigmund Freud kind of concept. Now, Sigmund Freud was the first rock star psychologist, and he developed one of the earliest theories of how personality works. And he argued that people are driven by desires and shame and embarrassments, and that our personality comes from managing the conflict between our desires and society's rules. Okay? Now, if you've ever heard of Sigmund Freud, you've probably heard of people laugh at him because Sigmund Freud thought that sex was the most important thing in people's life. And he argued that we're all born with this sexual instinct, and it causes us to want things and think things and do things that we would be embarrassed about. But he argues that these desires run counter to what society wants us to do. There are rules about what you can do sexually. And he argued the conflict between our desires and society's rules causes us to create behavior patterns to help us get what we want while not getting in trouble. And he argued that this is where personality came from. And he actually came up with some terms you may have heard before. I don't know if you've ever heard of somebody being called defensive. Anybody ever heard of somebody being called defensive? Oh, you're just being defensive. Can somebody in the chat bar tell me what you think it means when somebody says you're being defensive? Go ahead and type that in the chat bar. He came up with the term defense mechanisms. He came up with the concept of repression. And he also came up with the concept of projection. Okay? So, a defense mechanism is an unhealthy strategy people use to protect themselves from the anxiety caused by feelings of shame and guilt, right? Maybe you have a sexual crush that you're too embarrassed to admit. And so you treat that sexual crush very inconsiderately, and you're mean to them because you secretly don't like them and you don't want anybody to know that you really, really like them. Has anybody ever treated you mean and it turns out you found out later that they really liked you? Maybe they were just trying to hide the fact that they were infatuated with you and they were embarrassed. If so, that's what's called a defense mechanism. And Freud suggested that some people get so overcome by their feelings of desire or guilt that they create these strategies in their mind to hide the anxiety caused by these strategies. Now, we've given up a lot of Freud's beliefs in the modern day, but we still believe in defense mechanisms. People sometimes hide themselves from painful memories and painful beliefs. One of the main ways that people do that is they repress memories. Any of you ever heard of repressed memories? Sometimes people go into therapy as an adults and find out that they were abused sexually or otherwise as a child by somebody they loved and cared about, and they've forgotten the pain of that event, and they've hidden that way down deep in their subconscious. That's what's known as repression. And that's a term, sort of like when someone feels like they're being attacked and they get an angry and sad response. Sorry, still waking up? No, Rylan, I think that's a great way to do it. Some people feel like they're being attacked. Actually, they're not being attacked, but their own guilt is attacking them. That's a great point, though. I like what you're saying. They feel attacked. Most of the time, you're being attacked by your own feelings of guilt and shame. And so what you do is you repress that memory. You hide it from you. And you know what? Sometimes people even project their anxieties and guilt onto other people, right? So, have any of you ever been accused by a romantic partner of cheating or being unfaithful, only to find out later that that person was being unfaithful themselves? And you go, wow, maybe that person felt so guilty about what they were doing that they blamed it on me. Absolutely, Shaniqua, it happens all the time. That's what's known as projection. You know what? Some people, you'll see in the news, some people come out and act really homophobically, and they will say all kinds of bad and negative things about people who are homosexual. And then the news will come out and you'll find out that that person themselves was homosexual. And you say to yourself, wow, how could you say such mean things about homosexuals when you yourself had those same tendencies? The idea is this person was projecting their feelings onto another person because they were embarrassed about their own feelings. And so repression and projection are two kinds of defense mechanisms that people use to deal with guilt and embarrassment that they feel in their soul. And so Sigmund Freud was the first rock star psychologist. He became internationally famous with his theory of psychosexual development. And he added some very interesting viewpoints to the study of human beings. So now instead of thinking about just the function of mind, the function or the structure of mind, he suggested let's look at the function of unconscious conflicts. Now, a second important rock star in psychology was B.F. Skinner, and he and John Watson came from the behavioral school of psychology. Now, these guys didn't care too much for Sigmund Freud and his unconscious mechanism. Gustav, great question. He asks, is bullying a defense mechanism? Most of the time, I would say yes. What I've found in my experience, both as a kid and as watching my kids get bullied a little bit, is that most of these bullies have parents that make them feel inferior. So you'll notice most bullies get teased and picked on and made to feel bad by their parents. And they take this anger, since they can't act out on their parents, they'll take this anger and hatred that they feel towards themselves and they'll displace it towards other kids at school. Yes. Shaniqua Howell agrees with me. We both say that bullies are being defensive. Now, I know you probably don't want to feel sorry for a bully. I never felt sorry for the bullies that picked on me. But yes, they definitely have a reason. I'm actually really good friends with one of my bullies from elementary school. He's a good friend now, and he really, really likes me. He doesn't even remember that he bullied me as a 4th and 5th grader. But now that I've gotten to know him, we talk about our upbringing, and I find out that he was raised in a really sad household where his parents, especially his mom, had some unresolved psychological issues, and they made him feel really bad about himself. And so I've gotten over my feelings of anger at this gentleman because I realized that what happened to him is caused him to be the mean person that he was. Right? My dad taught me to try and befriend bullies when I was a kid for that exact reasons. Exactly, Jim Bro. Right? You just, you know, maybe you can give them love and help them get over their problems. It's tough to forgive a bully, but just remember that most of the time people do that stuff and they're getting out anxiety and anger that they feel that have been put on them. Wow. Shaniqua and Gustav, y'all bring up a great point. Great point. Now, John Watson was a behaviorist. Now, behaviorists didn't care much for this unconscious stuff. They thought that was non-scientific. Instead, they focused on the environment and how it changes our behavior. Do any of you have a pet dog that you've taught to do a trick? Maybe to sit, or to shake hands, or to go to the bathroom outside? Have any of you trained an animal to do a trick? If you have, you've used the behaviorist technique of conditioning. You've used the behaviorist technique of operant conditioning. You have taught your animal to do a trick by giving them a reinforcement, right? So how do you get a dog to learn how to sit down? You push their butt down, and when they sit down, you give them a treat. And then you say, sit, and when the dog sits down, you give them a treat. And after a while, whenever you tell your dog to sit, they will sit their butt down because they know a treat will be coming. That's what's known as operant conditioning, and you've used a positive reinforcer to reinforce your child's behavior. Did any of you ever get a spanking for doing something bad? Did any of you ever have your cell phone taken away for doing something bad? Did any of you ever have your car keys taken away for doing something bad? If you have, then your parents were using the behaviorist technique of punishment to try and change your behavior. So punishment and reinforcement are behaviorist techniques designed to change your behavior by shaping your environment. Gustavo and Shaniqua both were penalized at some point in their life. So your parents were using behaviorist technique. I would argue to you, I've raised two children, so I can say this, two successful children, so I can say this. Raising a child is in some ways similar to training a dog. I hate to say it, and I'm not downplaying children or elevating dogs, but the same techniques that will help you teach a dog to sit down, to go to the bathroom outside, or to shake hands are the same techniques that you can teach your child how to do their homework, how to be quiet, how to not do something when you say no. Those are all the same techniques. B.F. Skinner was into operant conditioning, and John Watson was the first person to demonstrate that you could classically condition someone to have a phobia. So you folks know what a phobia is. It's an unrealistic fear of an object that is way out of proportion to the actual danger posed by the object. And John Watson trained a little baby named Little Albert to have a phobia of white furry rats. And what he would do is he would put a rat in front of Little Albert, who initially was not scared of it, and he would come up behind Little Albert, and as soon as he would put the rat down, he would make a really loud noise and scare Little Albert. And so over the course of several days, he would put the rat in front of Albert, and then he would scare Little Albert. And after a while, Little Albert learned to associate the white rat with the scary noise. And after a while, when he showed Little Albert the white rat, Little Albert would start crying automatically. And he found that Little Albert became afraid of everything that reminded him of a white furry rat, including dogs and cats and any other furry item. Both of these guys represent what we will call the behaviorist approach, which says that who we are depends upon how we are shaped by your environment. Okay. So that's the second one. And then the third major approach, and we're going to talk about all three of these approaches over the course of the semester. That's why I'm introducing you to them. The other approaches we talk about in chapter 1, but these three approaches we're going to hit over and over and over again. The third approach is the cognitive approach, championed by a fellow named George Miller. And the cognitive approach was inspired by the invention of the first computers. The ENIAC was created in the late 1940s. It was the first true computer. And computers process information, right? You type information into the computer, you input it. The computer has a program, and that program takes that input, does machinations on computations on it, and spits out the answer that you want. And George Miller said that human minds are often like computers. We take information in, we have this program in our mind, in our brain, we'll call a mind, and this program processes that information. So for example, if I say 2 plus 2, each one of you says, and go ahead and type in the chat bar to show me you know your math skills, 2 plus 2 is 5, right? No, of course not. There you go. We have several people typing in 4. Think about it. You had a program in your mind that knows how to compute 2 plus 2 equals 4. That is your mind. And Gustav Miller was the first person that tried to understand the rules by which our mind operates. And he created the cognitive perspective. We got a lot of 4s there. Thank goodness. Great math students. Most of you must be in the calculus class. Okay. And so George Miller was the first person to really champion this mental approach. And I will tell you that the cognitive approach in cognitive neuroscience is the most popular form of psychology right now. Everybody's trying to figure out how the mind works. How does the mind work in relationships? How does the mind work in mental illness? How does the mind work when we're studying things? In fact, when we get to chapter 7, I'm going to give you some study tips that will help you have a perfect memory. How many of you would like to be able to remember things really easy so that you could study and remember things really well and make A's on your test? If you go to chapter 7, cognitive psychology in chapter 7, you will get a lot of tips on how to use your mind effectively to remember things. Gustav, I'm going to give you the keys to the kingdom when we get to chapter 7 in week 3. Okay? Fantastic. It would be nice. Now, here's the deal. What we're going to do today and tonight, actually in webinar, is we're going to talk about the modern subfields of psychology. So here's the thing. First, you have William James and Wilhelm Wundt saying, you know what, we should study the structure of the mind, or we should study the function of the mind. And then we had later guys like Freud who said, you know what, there are unconscious things that affect people. Or John Watson said, no, it's the environment that affects people. Or George Miller said, no, wait a minute, we can think of human beings as computers. These are all different ways of studying the human being. These are different approaches. But there was no one approach that really is better than the others. Now, after World War II, we had all of these people coming home from World War II, and they had post-traumatic stress disorder, brain injuries, and other psychological problems. And the people in the field of psychology said, wow, we've got a real problem we need to fix. And so psychology needs to become very, very professional. And after World War II, modern clinical psychology began to take shape. The kind of psychology that you appreciate when you go in to meet with your therapist and your psychiatrist and all those other people. Psychology became very, very professional. Before World War II, you really didn't have to pick a subfield of psychology. You just became trained or not in a field of psychology, and then you could just start doing research on any field of psychology. After World War II, modern subfields of psychology were created. We'll call them areas of specialization. And just like we have heart doctors or cardiologists, pediatric doctors, we have OBGYNs, we have podiatrists. Each and every one of these people is a doctor. However, they specialize in a specific kind of medicine. So for example, can anybody tell me what part of the body does a podiatrist study? Anybody know? What does a podiatrist study? Who knows? Who knows? Let's go ahead and see if we have a clever person out there. And if you know what a podiatrist does. Can anybody tell me what an OBGYN, what part of the body does the OBGYN study? So a podiatrist, oh my goodness, a podiatrist is a foot doctor. There we go. Martine, very good. A foot doctor is a podiatrist. Okay. An OBGYN, what kind of a doctor is an OBGYN? Anybody know? How about a cardiologist? What part of the body does the cardiologist study? Does anybody know? Okay. Let's see what we got in the chat bar here. Okay, Heavenly, very good. An OBGYN is a doctor that studies the female parts, and a cardiologist studies the heart. Absolutely. Now, here's the deal. If you were a lady and you were having trouble with your female parts, would you go to a podiatrist? Would you go to a podiatrist? Absolutely not. You'd go to an OBGYN. On the other hand, if you were having a heart attack, would you go to an OBGYN if you were having for heart surgery? Would you go to an OBGYN? Absolutely not. You would go to the person who specializes in your treatment. Now, they're all doctors, but each one of them has an area that they are professionally trained in. Just like there are specialties in the medical profession, there are professional specialties in the field of psychology. So, for example, I have a PhD, but I don't have a PhD in psychology. I have a PhD in social psychology. And if you look at this chart here on the left side that's in your textbook that has the subfields of psychology, you'll see that I am a social psychologist. I study how other people are affected by others. I am an expert in peer pressure, in group pressure, in how people behave in cults and larger groups. Do we have any ex-military students in this class? The military are experts in group behavior. And one of the things that the military does is they shave your head, put you in the same clothes, and tell you that you're worthless when you first show up to boot camp. And what they do is they break you down as an individual, and they take away your individual identity. And then over the course of 13 weeks, the military gives you a new identity as part of a group. Okay, Ryland Jiggins, you at least went to boot camp, right? They shave your head, they make you look just like everybody else, and they call you a grunt. And they make you talk about yourself in the third person, right? The private is interested. And what they do is they take your individuality away and they put you into this thing called a group. And they make you just a larger part of a group. And basically, I, as a psychologist, can appreciate how the Army uses the beliefs of groupness to help create a cohesive unit. Absolutely, all of that, right? And so I'm an expert in that part of human functioning. Now, every time I go to a cocktail party with my wife, her friends find out I'm a psychologist, and the first thing they tell me, they make the joke, boy, you could sure help me with my problems. And I always laugh, but I think to myself, no, I can't, because I'm not that kind of a psychologist. You know what kind of a psychologist can help you with your problems? A clinical psychologist. A clinical psychologist is the person who treats you with psychological disorders. Now, if you go to your clinical psychologist and ask them to explain how the military tears an individual down and creates a new individual that's part of a group, a clinical psychologist is not going to be able to tell you as much as I could, because they don't specialize in that type of psychology. And so each and every psychologist has a different kind of training. And when you go to graduate school, when I applied to graduate school, I applied to a social program. Some people apply to clinical programs. Some people apply to developmental programs. So each and every one of psychologists you will ever meet is trained to have a very specific set of knowledge in a very specific area of expertise. Vanessa, they forgot to give me a new identity though. Ha ha. Actually, I will be honest, there are different levels of indoctrination depending upon your type of service. The Marines, since those are the ones that are usually on the front line doing the most dangerous and crazy things, charging machine gun sniper nests and throwing bombs and getting blown up, they need to be indoctrinated just a little more deeply than does an Air Force person who is back at the base running the radars and computers. So that's a good point. The indoctrination level of indoctrination is different depending upon your area of expertise. That's a great point, Vanessa. Okay, here's the deal. Before we go, I do want to direct you to a website that's in your course resources. This is what we're going to be talking about tonight. And this is the psychology subfields. I found this on the APA, the American Psychological Association's website. And here are 15 of the most popular subfields in psychology. There's brain science and cognitive psychology. There's environmental psychology. There's clinical psychology. There's counseling psychology. There's developmental psychology. There's experimental psychology. There's forensic or court psychology. There's health psychologists that help us learn healthy habits of living. There are human factors and engineering psychologists that help us design technology to work with how people want to use technology. There's the psychology of teaching and learning. How do people learn best? There's quantitative psychology that helps create personality and intelligence tests. There's rehab psychologists, which help people learn how to deal with disabilities and chronic health issues. There's social psychologists like me, who help people learn how to work in groups. And there are sports psychologists that help people perform at their maximum level, even though they may get nervous. These are the main forms, the most popular subfields of psychology. And what I want you to do for this semester, for this test, is I want you to be familiar with what each of these psychologists does, so that from now on, whenever you meet a psychologist, the first question you will ask them is, instead of saying, hey, can you help me with my psychological problems, you will say, what area of psychology are you from? And when they tell you what area, you will have a general idea of what they do. For this week's discussion board, what you're going to do is tell the class which subfield you think is most interesting and which you would do if you had a chance to go to graduate school. That will be the basis of this week's discussion board, and it'll also be what we talk about tonight in webinar. Okay, does anybody have any questions? It's 9:50, time for me to log off and get to my Psychology 118 class. Do any of you have questions? It was great to meet you, and I do want to thank you for coming today. I'll be here every morning, Monday through Thursday, from 9 to 9:50, giving psychology lectures. I do hope you join me, but if you can't join me, you can watch these as recordings. The links for the live lectures will become recordings as soon as the recording ends. So, you are always welcome to join me, and I hope that this lecture gives you a little bit of insight into this week's content. Fantastic. I look forward to seeing you tonight at 7 o'clock. Have a great day, and if you have any questions, don't hesitate to send me a text on Remind or email me. Have a great day. Bye.